evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so very honored to welcome Andrea J. Ritchie in conversation with Kamau Franklin and Micah Herskin for a discussion of practicing new worlds, abolition, and emergent strategies. It is an exploration of how emergent strategies can help us meet this moment, survive what is to come, and shape safer and more just futures. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by Community Movement Builders, a member-based collective of Black people creating sustainable, self-determining communities through cooperative economic advancement and collective community organizing. So I'll introduce Kamau Franklin first because he is the founder of Community Movement Builders, Inc. Kamau has been a dedicated community organizer for over 30 years, beginning in New York City and now based in Atlanta. For 18 of those years, Kamau was a leading member of a national grassroots organization dedicated to the ideas of self-determination and the teachings of Malcolm X. He has spearheaded organizing work in various areas, including youth organizing and development, police misconduct, and the development of sustainable urban communities. Kamau has coordinated and led community cop watch programs, liberation freedom schools for youth, electoral and policy campaigns, large-scale community gardens, and organizing collectives and alternatives to incarceration programs. He was an attorney for 10 years in New York with his own practice in criminal, civil rights, and transactional law. He now lives in Atlanta with his wife and 2 children. So welcome, Kamau. We're so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're joined by Micah Herskin, who is an organizer, writer, and law student, and so much more, but kept his bio very brief. So we're glad you're here, Micah. And the person of the hour is Andrea J. Ritchie, who is a Black lesbian immigrant survivor who has been documenting, organizing, advocating, litigating, and agitating around policing and criminalization of Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people for the past 4 decades. She is co-founder of Interrupting Criminalization and the In Our Names Network, a network of over 20 organizations working to end police violence against Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people. In these capacities and through the Community Resource Hub, she works with dozens of groups across the country organizing to divest from policing and invest in strategies that will create safer communities. Ritchie is the co-author with Miriam Kaba of No More Police. She is a nationally recognized researcher, policy analyst, and expert on policing and criminalization, and she lives in Detroit, Michigan. So we're so glad that everyone is here with us. We're so glad to have so many of you with us here in the chat, watching from a lot of folks from Atlanta, but I see folks that I know from around the country. So thank you for spending time with us tonight. We have already dropped the chat link to Practicing New Worlds, so we'll be referencing that at various points. You can click on that to learn more. And Andrea, I don't know if you want to hold up your t-shirt, but folks will see this beautiful art, and you'll be wanting to click that link and access it. I want to let folks know you can put your questions in the chat, and if there's time, we will work those into the conversation. But without further ado, please welcome our beautiful participants for this important conversation.
I'm just talking to myself, I was just giving Kamau grief as a Gen Xer and then just pulled some boomer mute stuff. Okay. So, which I'm not a boomer. Yeah, I'm so grateful to Karis Books for hosting this event. I feel like it's a place that I come back to have conversations about organizing towards liberation through a feminist lens in the South, and that always ground me. And I'm grateful for all the programming that you all do, and grateful to be here tonight to talk about practicing new worlds, but more importantly, the fight to stop Cop City and how it's connected to the fight to end the occupation in Palestine and to stop the genocide that's happening there now. And I think that's where I want to start tonight, but because in some ways, Practicing New Worlds is a book for this moment, when we feel powerless to shift massive systems of violence that are colluding in unspeakable and unfathomable violence. And we feel like how many of us, I think, on October 7th felt like, how can we stop this? Our government is fully invested in this. It's fully throwing money at this. And then we see how we've been able to shift that through individual and collectivized action, how we're continuing to shift it, certainly not far and fast enough, but we're able to do that. And in other ways, it's a book that this moment kind of highlights the weaknesses in some ways of emergent strategies. And I feel particularly humbled to be in this conversation tonight with Kamau Franklin, who, like me, came up in a very different political tradition that is very sort of focused on, seizure of the state, material, top-down kind of organizing, and in some ways, emergent strategies and the things that we build with them are, when the threat of the state, seeing that as a threat and coming down and crushing those, is really something that I and other people I spoke to when I was writing the book all named as something where we were like, yeah, this all sounds great, but what happens when the state sees this as a threat and comes crashing down on us? What then with our decentralized, iterative, interdependent networks? Those can get destroyed in the natural world, and those can get destroyed in the organizing world. And what does emergent strategy offer for those moments? And at the same time, we're seeing that that's how people, to the extent people are surviving now, they're surviving through decentralized networks that are adapting and shifting and moving in ways that are intended to push back against larger systems of violence. So it's both a book for this moment, a stretch, a gap, and a response at the same time. So I feel grateful to be in conversation also about how these things are playing out with the Cop City fight. But I think I wanted to start with really lifting up for folks the connections between the fight to stop Cop City and the fight to end the occupation and stop the genocide in Palestine, because there's some really direct connections in recent days that have been made with the APD, like simulating a raid targeting Hamas folks in a hotel in Atlanta. There's so many connections, and I hope that folks can lift those up, because I think the other thing this book really wants to really lift up is that abolition is transnational and abolitionist struggles are transnational because the systems that we're fighting are transnational, and our resistance has to be transnational. And I know that that's something that the fight to stop Cop City really highlights. So I wanted to ask y'all to start us off by talking about that.
I mean, I'll jump in really quickly and say, one, thank you for having us. Sorry about the old man technical difficulties, but that comes with having old men on. And I think you're completely right. Like, I do come from a generation that was far more top down, right, in terms of its organizing structures, rigid in terms of its coalition building. Doesn't mean it was ineffective, but it certainly means it was another style of organizing. And I think I recently remarked in Micah's presence that of all the organizing I've ever done, the ways in which Cop City has mobilized, or the fighting against Cop City, the different organizations and individuals, cadre groups, different people have approached this. For me, it's been one of the sort of greatest organizing efforts, or maybe the greatest organizing effort I've ever been a part of. And I think part of that is the fact that it is not dependent on one group to survive, nor one individual. When folks get tired or burnt out or have other activities that they have to engage in, whether or not that's personal or organizing, there have been always people who have stepped up and made sure that that organizing continues. And I think that's something that people of my generation certainly have learned and can learn from. And one of the larger efforts and one of the larger, I think, lessons that have come out of it is also having some principled points of unity about how we work with each other, which allows us to do the different types of work that we do and still come back and support each other, not turn against each other, not vis-a-vis sell out each other because someone sticks a microphone in our face or someone threatens us with some particular charges. And I think, again, those things have been fantastic in terms of the ways in which organizing has happened. And then quickly, I'll say, obviously, the connections to Palestine and what's happening now. Um, I think obviously for a lot of the folks who've been organizing around Cop City, one of the earliest things that we always remarked upon was the fact that the city of Atlanta was doing training with the Israeli IDF and police departments, and that the strategies and tactics that they were using in Palestine would be imported here, we would say, and the strategies and tactics used against us here would be exported there. And I think what I think that's continued to be been the case. And I think ideologically speaking, we know that this is not new. And one of the things that I think that has really been sort of resurgent in terms of keeping a left here is that old school white supremacy, capitalist domination still exists. It takes on its own new forms. And one of the things I think that this moment has done for a lot of us is just to continue to make sure that we understand how capitalism functions, how the West functions, how militaristic the West is, and that what they will do and allow to happen in places like Palestine shows us why we need so much unity, both here locally, nationally, and internationally, because capital is not local, capital is transnational.
Yeah.
Yeah. So many points to pick up on. And yeah, I think to drive home even just the frame of the question you asked about connections, and like sometimes I think in my head, like, oh, like what are the parallels? And no, they're not parallels. They are very explicit connections between Atlanta, Israel, oppressive forces everywhere. Like Kamal mentioned, there's the Gilead program here, Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, which is literally a training program that universities here in Georgia work. I guess I'm not in Georgia right now. Universities in Georgia, the Atlanta Police Department, Georgia Police Forces, the Israeli Defense Force, like they are all training together. We are exporting and we are importing tactics. We are all through international policing, and all these international networks that these powerful institutions have. They're always trying out various policing tactics abroad and bringing them back and then re-exporting them. And so there are these really explicit connections. And then there are, I think looking at what's happening in Atlanta, looking at what's happening in Palestine, you can see, I think there's so much about how power works and how oppression works. And so, I mean, yeah, one other quick connection is literally an Atlanta Community Press Collective reporter reported a couple of days ago that APD, the Atlanta Police Department, was running, this drill in what they thought was an abandoned hotel, running it to remove Hamas from this hotel, because we all know that Hamas is coming to Atlanta, just like so outrageous. And, this is not beside the point, but not directly connected. While they were doing this drill in this hotel they thought they were abandoned, they came across people who were living there, and there's just the connection to Atlanta's anti-homelessness and gentrification policies and practices, where we're giving all this money to the Atlanta police force, not housing people, then we're running these drills with these terrorist framings and actually putting unhoused people in further harm. And so we have these sorts of connections. Of course, I think that both movements really force us to think about the terrorist frame itself. And, all Palestinians are being framed as terrorists. All Stop Cop City activists are being framed as terrorists. And the utility of the terrorist frame is that it licenses the state to go in and wreak as much damage and violence as possible. And that's what we've seen when they, marched into the forest and assassinated Tortuguita in January 2023. That's what we see as they are, committing genocide in Gaza in the name of stopping terrorism. And so, there's just so many connections, so many relationships of power that are behind, what's happening in Atlanta and what's happening in Palestine.
It's so true. And when we think about interrupting criminalization, this labeling of people as domestic terrorists in Atlanta, or an entire people, an entire population, half of which is children, as terrorists, is kind of the ultimate of criminalization, right? And so it's like the end of the spectrum. Right. And so when we're fighting abolitionist struggles to try and uproot criminalization as a practice, we're doing that globally and domestically. And it's also happening to people who are resisting or speaking out against the genocide. And you're not in Atlanta, Micah, you are at Harvard, which, you know, you went against Andrea's recommendation, but whatever. I just want to note that Howard University students walked out today with, you know, thousands of students on campuses across the country, just big up Bisons. But yeah, you went to Harvard, and there's a huge movement there to repress students from speaking out on Palestine. And you know, I write in the book about organizing against apartheid in South Africa when I was in college, and how, yes, I came up in those top-down kind of, you know, Alinsky organizing strategies, but when I reflected back on anti-apartheid organizing, it was, like you're saying, Kamau, actually something that was more effective because it was decentralized. We were all united around a call from the ANC to divest and boycott from South Africa, but it was decentralized. We all just looked around where we were, saw what around us was invested in South Africa, and went for that. So for me, it was my university. For other people, it was their employer. For other people, it was corporations they held shares in. For other people, it was cultural work. For other people, it was Shell Oil. For all of us, it was Shell Oil, right? And just sort of operating in a unified political frame, but in a decentralized way, where we were watching what other people were doing. We were kind of replicating strategies. We were iterating them as they were working and not working, and then adapting but shifting a system that had existed for decades with the cooperation and participation of the Israeli government, PS, right? They have been cooperating for a long time and learning from each other for a long time. And we're able to make a shift that way globally under the leadership of folks who are under occupation, under apartheid. And it feels like a similar moment, but what I was reflecting on is that we weren't facing quite the same kind of opposition. We were definitely facing entrenched white supremacy. Cops definitely had my picture and other organizers' pictures up on their lockers and made all kinds of lewd comments, whatever. That was, and no one was trying to, they did a typical anti-protester thing, like Andrea's a rabble rouser, you know, whatever, but they weren't trying to keep me from ever being employed again and calling me, you know, a bigot in a different way, right? Like it was clear I was against white supremacy. They were equivocating around white supremacy, but no one was trying to say I was someone who should never be employed, never be able to speak, never be able to exist in the way that anti-apartheid students now are being targeted. So I'm curious if you can kind of reflect on this moment where students are walking out, students are speaking out, and facing different consequences in this iteration of anti-apartheid resistance.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so just for context, I am currently a Harvard Law student, as Andrea outed me. And actually, I think both Andrea and Kamau told me not to go. So I'm here against the advice of both of these elders. And yeah, I said it. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, so for people who don't know, you know, and Harvard is just one place where this is happening. This is happening on campuses all over the country. But you know, when Harvard students put out basically a statement in solidarity with Palestine, immediately this billionaire and then a bunch of other CEOs and, you know, a bunch of other right wingers, and, you know, even we've seen liberals participate in this, you know, basically engaged in this huge doxing effort in order to dox all of the students, you know, who are involved in the statement. This billionaire hired this truck that, as of a couple of days ago, was still driving around Harvard Square, that has the, you know, the names and the faces of students who signed on with, you know, the words Harvard's leading anti-Semites. You know, they've you know, networked in order to try to make sure that students can't get jobs. Students, you know, across a lot of universities have lost their job offers that they previously had, and so there, you know, there is this really, really explicit effort to, you know, basically try to you know, crush students into silence, you know, and to say, you'll never be able to work again. You know, you won't be able to get a job. We're going to physically put you in danger. You know, a lot of the students who have been doxxed, like, doxing is a violent thing because it means that people, you know, a lot of people are staying in their homes. They're not going to class because they're terrified. And so, you know, it's really meant to have this, you know, this ripple effect to make an example out of people and say, like, look, these people spoke out and we came after them, so you better stay quiet too. And what I will say is that, I think this is somewhere for hope, and we see this in the Stop Cop City movement too, is that despite that, there have continued to be huge protests, and there was a huge protest at Harvard, there's a huge protest in Boston, there was another walkout today, and so I find a lot of hope in that.
Yeah, let's just shout out dissenters who organize people on campuses to walk out across the country in something that was, again, not covered by the news, in the way that mass protests are not being covered, the way that mass resistance is not being covered in many ways. But I'm grateful for that work. And also it reminds me of the Stop Cop City organizers who are also being forced into their dorm rooms in the case of one person indicted because the chancellor of the university, who's major, connected to the major donors to Cop City, basically convinced the university that this person should be able to go to class and should have to, attend school, if at all, from home. And so there's just this real kind of, if you speak out, we will absolutely crush your future prospect and your ability to be in conversation and community with others. So
I was going to say quickly, and in most cities have now passed resolutions saying that they support Israel. These different businesses and college admission, college offices, leadership bodies have also passed resolutions. And so it's really been the grassroots efforts similar to Cop City, which have made this sort of a breakthrough issue, where it's you get one media narrative, and I think it's really important to talk about the narrative for both issues, but you get one media narrative which doesn't really represent what's happening on the ground. And like you said, and they hide what's happening on the ground. You get the media narrative of what Israel is vis-a-vis the connections. And obviously one of the differences between the apartheid movement in South Africa is that there was no open constituency supporting those who were sort of, let's say, the settlers or the owners, right? Of the land, or those who took the land. Here, there's an extremely strong open constituent relationship in terms of creating a narrative, and part of that narrative is a security narrative. And just like Cop City, the narrative of needing security and the so-called security that cops provide is the narrative that's pushed by establishment politicians and establishment media / corporate media, which again is something that we all have to continually fight against. And I just think that what will happen, we will see. But at least here and now, in terms of the Palestinian struggle, there seems to be this extremely important shift on the ground in terms of these huge demonstrations that I've never seen in terms of even my decades of support or solidarity with Palestinians here in the United States. There's been, some pretty good sized marches, but nothing compared to what's happened over the last couple of weeks. And so I think that's something that people, as Micah was suggesting, need to take some solace and some understanding about. What the mobilizations have been fantastic. And now's the time to turn those mobilizations into real organizing that can sustain the effort for future battles and ongoing battles to come in terms of the Palestinian struggle, but also the larger left struggle around the dominant influence of capitalism, Western imperialism, Western colonialism, and how that project is still at work, how Western hegemony is still at work, both locally, again, within the different nation states, but internationally, and how that has to be broken by left forces, and how Cop City is one fight, but it is not the only battle in terms of what it means for what's happening on the ground today in terms of organizing.
Yeah, I think also this piece about informational power as part of our organizing power is really important. And I think we're seeing the response to that, right? Which is now the president is like, well, who says that many people have been killed? It's grotesque, right? It's just revolting to hear him say that. And that is a response to us sharing information through our networks, through our communities, through relationship and networks with Palestinians in Gaza speaking out and connecting with us and saying, get this word out, tell this. And so that's the response, is that the horrors are being seen and they're trying to pretend they're not existent, right? Which is even more outrageous. But I think it's a small parallel, but I think it's sort of similar when cops are like, crime is up, and no one verifies their data, right? And no one's asking anyone else to verify their numbers of dead, but somehow the numbers of people who have been, bombed by more bombs in the US dropped on Afghanistan in an entire year, the equivalent of the Hiroshima bomb in 17 days. Somehow there's a question about how many people have been killed, have been murdered, have been blown away. It's horrifying, and a response to the power that we're building through sharing the messages through our networks, when the mainstream media networks are pushing a narrative that's justifying genocide.
Yeah. Well, so on this question of, building power and the kind of movements that we need, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Andrea's amazing book, which I think you all can see on the screen a link to buy it. But it's so relevant for this moment, of course, because it's talking about exactly how do we take on these forces. And so I want to tee up a question with one quick line from the beginning of the book and then a paragraph from near the end of the book. The first is just the first line of the book, and this book is about emergent strategy and abolitionist organizing. The first line of the book is just, I am an unlikely emergent strategist. So you say, this is not something that this is new. This was new for you. And then near the end of the book, in the conclusion, you talk about some questions that folks were, reflecting on, and organizers and scholars, in the transition from apartheid to post-apartheid South Africa, these various questions of how do we prepare for the life we want to live? What is the work of liberation? What sort of relational work and psychic work and work do we need to do? What processes need to take place in, around, and between us for liberation to manifest? What sorts of skills and schooling do we need? Basically, like, what is it that we need to do to make way for the future that we want? And I'm going to read this sentence and then ask you a question. Is, you say, I have come to the conclusion that some of the answers to these questions lie in emergent strategies, in pursuing greater understanding of how we transform structures of oppression by transforming ourselves, our relationships, networks, and communities of practice, rather than seeking and putting all our faith in top-down approaches that depend on and are of the systems we are fighting. And so clearly you've gone through a transformation in I don't know, however many years, but coming to emergent strategy, and you've been so involved in organizing spaces for so long. And so I'd love if you could just, tell people about sort of how did you come to emergent strategy? What is it? Tell us a little bit about what it is, and, what do you think its value is in this moment as we're facing all of these overlapping crises of settler colonialism and racial capitalism and all the different violences that we're facing?
I mean, I think I came to it somewhat in the way that Kamau was talking about, which is that, I've been organizing, agitating, litigating. Kamau and I used to trade off being legal support for Cop Watch in New York City. When I had a police misconduct case that was over my head, I sent it to Kamau or asked him questions about it or whatever. Like, it's work. I've been doing kind of this work that has been focused on law and I was an organizer for much longer than I've been a lawyer, although I think that number is evening out now as I've gotten older. But a lot of the work I've been doing, whether as an organizer or as a lawyer, has been focused on government, on the state, on law, on policy, on the system, right? And not thinking that we find justice in the system, but thinking that we can reduce harm by sort of pushing back the system and trying to dismantle it from that approach. And then it was kind of like someone else needs to figure out the world that we're building, right? Someone else is doing that. I don't know, like visionaries are doing that. But my job is to fight with and tackle the state through the state's machinery. And then, for a lot of my life, that was the goal, was seize the state to, in the service of the people kind of thing. And as Kamau was sort of describing the experience of, wow, this campaign of Stop Cop City, which actually is nothing like that, is one of the most successful and impactful and transformational campaigns I've ever been in, is a process that I came to over years, because I didn't have a Stop Cop City campaign to show me that in some way, but that I came to through watching abolitionist organizing and have abolitionist organizers say, yes, there is harm reduction to be done. There are non-reformist reforms to be done, but that's the tip of the iceberg. And if we focus all of our efforts to building abolition by trying to make it happen through the machinery of a carceral state, we're just going to keep reproducing the same thing. And if we keep doing this top-down mass mobilization model, that is sort of how we were taught, is that, we have to build movements at the scale of industrialization, at the mass scale to meet mass problems. We're going to keep replicating those systems in our movements too. And that actually, groups like Creative Interventions, who I've been able to learn from Mimi Kim for 2 decades now, we're at the level of, here's one harm. How can we mobilize the people around the harm to interrupt, prevent, and transform the conditions that produce the harm? And how can that change everyone in that community in such a way that the next harm and the next situation, how do we replicate that out? And people saying to me, like, yeah, girl, this policy work you do, I mean, sure, go ahead and reduce harm, but that's not all of it. That's a very small part of it. And then experiencing that for myself, and then sort of noticing, like, what were the kinds of work that I was seeing were bringing us closer to abolitionist futures. And they were things that Adrienne Brown describes in the book Emergent Strategy as emergent strategy. But then when I was looking into it, it has a really deep kind of it pulls together many different threads: indigenous lifeways, complexity science, an understanding that we are of the natural world, and the way systems shift in the natural world, ecosystem shift, is also the way human societies shift, is also the way our brains shift, and that we can learn from those things. That we're not like, oh, we're not in the natural world. And it's so interesting to come out, because people were like, when Marx and them are materialists, like, they were also looking at the natural world, because that is it's a materialist approach. And I just was like, because I kept thinking, like, oh, this is a departure from materialist dialectical politics that we came up in, but it's actually not. It's a new way of understanding that, or not a new way of understanding. It's just a different way of understanding it, in terms of how we shift systems. So it's an understanding that change happens through small interactions, through critical connections, but undertaken with a shared intention, and in ways that are iterative, that move us towards a future or a way of being, new social relations, new economic relations, new political relations, new forms of governance, but through relationships and through community. So it's basically about organizing, right? But organizing in a way that's not how we've come to talk about organizing, which is actually mobilization, mass mobilization, right? Of faceless masses. It's actually going back to what organizing actually is, which is transforming in relationship with each other, popular education, popular movements, and understanding that we shift systems through our interactions and through the ways that we move through the world and in movements. And I think the part about transforming yourself to transform the world, I think, was something that, or that Mary Hooks's, mandate for Black people in this time is to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generations, and to be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. I think that part was hard for me to understand, because, what we came up in was like, fight till you drop, and then get up and fight again, and don't think about, like, to the extent that you do any healing in your own, it's kind of on the side, but that's not the work. And I think that what I learned also is that we have to figure out how to become the people who can bring about the world that we want. And that requires that we be transformed in the process of doing the work. And Grace Lee Boggs talks about, a lot of philosophers and scholars and organizers talk about that, but I think this just helped me see that in other ways. So I think, and I've seen that in Stop Cop City, from talking to people in terms of how they've been transformed by the process of being in the forest together, how they've been transformed in the process of being part of a decentralized movement together, how they've been transformed in their understanding of the connections between various struggles, whether it's they came in as environmentalists and they came out as abolitionists, or they came out as abolitionists and came in as abolitionists, came out as environmentalists, or as, Black community movement builders. I think it's about the process of change, and I'm not explaining it as well as I hopefully did in the book, but it's about really delving into the process of change and understanding it. And I do want to say that I was finishing it as Stop Cop City was jumping off, or the repression of Stop Cop City organizing was becoming more clear, and as right after Tortuguita was murdered, and I was sort of in real time looking at something that was manifesting some of the ideas that I was grappling with and trying to crystallize. And I wasn't able to write very much about it because of publishing deadlines, but it did feel very resonant. And that's why I wanted to be in conversation with you all, because I'm curious how some of these ideas of decentralization, adaptation, iteration, relationship-based organizing, critical connections, communities of practice, and networks, how you see those showing up in the movement to stop Cop City, and also particularly in this moment of repression, of resistance.
I mean, I'll jump in real quick because I feel like part of what for me is, when I say that the movement into diversity, the flatness is so spectacular, it's not even so much that everybody practices in the same way. It's more so that everybody's allowed to practice in different ways.
Yeah.
Bring that together for purposes of conquering or fighting back against a larger ill. And so individually, I think there's different things about flattened structure and even anarchist views that I think for years have been seeping into my own consciousness and political beliefs. And at its heart, you mentioned earlier, like, yeah, I'm individually still a materialist. I'm probably still more on the side of fight, drop, and you get back up and fight more.
Same.
Yeah.
It's a process.
No. But the different values that people have brought in, and analysis, and ways of practicing organizing, and ways of taking breaks even at times so they can continue to fight, I think brings a certain longevity to movement potentially, that folks may not have. Now, of course, again, there's some differences. There's ways in which things are applied. But my basic philosophy in terms of what I see is still the fight and build philosophy of, like, yes, you still challenge the state, you still fight back against the policy and or the sort of innate capitalist and development structures which harm our people, and at the same time you build the alternatives that you would like to see, and whether or not that comes to the mutual aid / liberation programs as we do them, the sort of, again, more flattening of structure than what we've had in years in terms of organizing, particularly Black radical organizing. I think it's something new and dynamic that needs to be contemplated and dealt with and understood. I think all of that mix adds to, and I think the moment in time that we're in, that these things are being applied in terms of we are, I think I told Micah this about a tweet that he did a few weeks ago now, is that we're in this moment of time where you no longer have to imagine what you would have done during certain sort of epochs of history, because you're in a time in history where things are showing themselves in a certain way that is very dramatic, that is unfolding before our very eyes. It's capitalists trying to survive. It's them using all the powers they have to try to destroy movements. And it is actually the growth of movements at a particular time in which people are experimenting with new ideas, new ways in which to struggle, bringing in new terms and things that we all have to contemplate and deal with. Doesn't mean everything people bring in is perfect, but if there's a contemplation of it and understanding of it that is making movement more dynamic and more alive than at any point in my history of organizing that I've either been a part of or seen. And I think that's one of the things that's like sort of telling and so important about what we're living through. And so for us as organizers, it's, what do we take? How do we use it? How do we make sure we don't throw away what like our folks did in the 60s and 70s that was good, but also what we don't replicate that led to some very bad outcomes individually and collectively, that we move forward in. And so I think all those things are very important things that we need to be examining now.
And I think that was part of it too, is I just was like, how we can't keep relying on the same things that keep producing the same results, right? Like, yes, we're in a longue durée fight to dismantle a police state and carceral racial capitalism. That's not going to happen overnight. We can't be like, oh, that didn't work in the last year, so we have to try something new. But I do think that to a certain extent, we have to stop reaching for the same tools of the system that we're trying to dismantle and live otherwise. And I was trying to be like, what other strategies, what other approaches could happen? And I think the other piece of thinking relationally about, sort of critical connections and relationships and networks and how we can shift larger systems through relationship-based organizing was the magnitude of what we're facing right now is overwhelming, right? And for many years, because of the kind of savior or charismatic leader narrative and approach, we've been looking for like, who's got the answer? Who's got the answer? And even people will hear me be like, who's got the plan? When Trump was elected, I was like, who's got the plan? Like, tell me where that plan is so I can go. And it's like, oh, we all have the plan. We all have to be part of the plan. We all need. There's not one savior coming. We are it. And we are the ones who are going to shape the future. And we have to understand that we all play a part in that. And I think one thing I say in the book that, understanding abolition as fractal or something that replicates itself based in small interactions or small systems or small structures brings, abolition into the realm of the actionable. And it makes people understand, like, I can do a thing in the same way that we're saying to people, you can do a thing today to shift the situation in Palestine. You can speak out. You can make a phone call. You can be in the streets. You can talk to your family. You can talk to your Jewish comrades. You can talk to your Zionist, not comrades, your people in your community who are Zionists who, might be folks who can be shifted, because there are people speaking out now who are like, I was brainwashed. I understand now in the face of this how I was brainwashed. And so there are people who are movable that we can be engaging, and it's understanding that we're not waiting for someone else to do this. There's no magical leader, Messiah who's coming. It's us. We're all we have in this moment. And so how can we be intentional about how we move and learning from various traditions and the world around us, which moves are going to have the greatest impact individually and collectively. So I was just like, we just need to try as many things as we can in this moment, because the magnitude of what we're living through is something that can't be met with the tools that we've been using.
Whew. Yeah, so many things to say to that. And in part, I don't know if you saw the question, Andrea, but you sort of answered a question that Yolanda had, which is, what do you think Americans are waiting to see or experience before they make a shift in their mindsets and practices around current models of supremacy and genocide here and globally? And, I wonder if you want to answer that more explicitly at all. But, I think that, something that the Stop Cop City movement has shown me is like, things really do often happen on we can get these mass mobilizations after something really horrible happens, and people are in the streets right now, which is amazing. But then you also have to get people from the streets into the organizing meetings, or onto their next door neighbor's porch for a conversation, or wherever it might be. Like, that's where the organizing comes in. And as I was reading your book, I know you were writing it before so much of the Stop Cop City movement was happening, but like, if people listening, are following the Stop Cop City movement, it's like reading sort of, it gives you so much scaffolding to understand sort of what the shape of the movement has looked like, and just, how many different, pieces and corners and lanes there are in the movement. And I think Kamau mentioned this earlier, but there's been this ebb and flow of like, in sort of summer 2021, things really looked like this more sort of like above ground campaign where, people were canvassing and calling their representatives and trying to stop this lease from going through and trying to, sort of stop it at City Hall. And then City Hall approved it. And so, the broad decentralized movement adapted, and people moved into the forest, and people built whole communities there and practiced mutual aid and set up, these tree sits, and they faced a lot of repression for it. And there were times where the park, and the forest were totally closed off to people. And then people hit the streets again, and, people were back at City Hall. And then we lost the funding fight. And now people are doing the referendum. And upcoming in November, there's this huge action called Block Cop City. I think you can go to blockcopcity.org if you want to find, if you're in Atlanta or you want to go to Atlanta for this November 10th, 11th, 12th action. And so there's just this ebb and flow where like not everyone's going to be doing everything at all times. And, you know, sometimes people do need to rest. And the people after that summer of 2021 were exhausted, and then new energy came in. And so that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say is sort of, you know, to this question of, you know, how does the state contend with it when it becomes a threat? Obviously, you know, through criminalization is, you know, what we've seen in state violence, you know, police murder. Something that I think is really interesting, though, and Andrea was actually interrupting criminalization, was part of putting out this sort of annotated version of the RICO indictment against Stop Cop City organizers. Something that sort of I think the state can't really comprehend these decentralized movements. So the theory that they put forward, you know, in this RICO case is that actually this movement, which in reality is very decentralized, there's no leader calling the shots. There's no person saying, you know, you go here, you go here. It is this very like organic ground up thing, but the state can't comprehend that. They are, you know, their theory of the case is that this one organization, a bail fund, is actually like the ringleader for this criminal enterprise.
Their theory is that a Twitter account is a ringleader.
Right. I mean,
it's so absurd. A thing.
Right. Like it's so, you know, I think that they can't end decentralization, which to me is a strong argument in its favor. Anyway, those are some things I wanted to say in response to some of what's come up. But yeah, I wonder, if you have anything to say to that, or there are also some questions in the chat. I think people are wondering, like, what are some ways that you know, emergent strategy and abolitionist practices can show up in the workplace, in public education? What is it going to take to, you know, to spur people to action?
Well, I think that to answer the second question first, is that people have to understand interdependence. And I think that's one of the principles of emergent strategy. If we don't understand what Kamau was saying at the beginning, which is that what we're watching in Palestine is something that directly impacts us. From watching it transforms us as humans to watch another people be genocided or our own people be genocided. I think it also means that those tactics, you know, move across borders and with, you know, through the systems that shape our lives as well. And so we need to understand the interdependence between, as Palestinian organizers did in 2014, when they saw people being gassed in the streets of Ferguson, they were like, oh, we know that. Here, this is how we deal with that. And we need to understand that, you know, our liberation is bound up with each other. And I think that's what's going to take for Americans. I think this notion of American exceptionalism, that somehow the US is different and the best place on earth, and for better or worse, this is, you know, the place where we're all free, or there's a potential for us all to be free. And those other places, it's really complicated. We can't understand. It's a lot of going on. No, like, it's the same. And what stop and frisk looks like in Palestine is very similar to stop and frisk in New York City in some ways, right? People being stripped on their corners, people, you know, pregnant people being stopped at a border and made to sit there for as long as the cop decides that's going to happen, while also being sexually assaulted. Like, it's very similar in some ways, even if it's on a further end of the spectrum. And we have to understand our interdependence in resisting those practices in service of our own humanity, but also in service of our own liberation. And I think that's what Americans need to understand, that we're not some isolated island. And I don't know why I'm saying we, because I haven't been an American very long, but like, people living in the US are not some isolated island of a different place, that we're interdependent. And I think that example of how people can employ abolition emergent strategies in workplaces and public education is just in every conversation. What are you practicing? Are you practicing decolonization in every conversation? Are you talking about the fact that we too live in a settler colonial colony that was created and forced through a genocide and apartheid ongoing? You know, Indigenous people continue to be the most incarcerated, like per capita, most incarcerated in this country. Like, do we people still are confined to reservations where there's often no running water or electricity, you know, as a matter of day-to-day existence? Like, are we understanding those things, and are we making those connections in our conversations? And the last thing I'll say is that I talk about in the book about how the right is also employing these strategies, and I'm going to talk more about that with Shane Burley on Monday at Firestorm Books. But they're very clear that every conversation in your workplace, every conversation in your school, every conversation in your family, every funeral, every wedding, every barn raising, every moment is an opportunity to shape the worldview of people around you. And
The
they have
right
been
group
doing that.
believes in grassroots organizing. Everything you
Exactly.
do believe and practice
Exactly.
organizing. So
Exactly. And they practice these strategies.
yeah,
And
They do.
so that's how we can do it every day. First, we have to understand that. And then just every conversation you have, what are you practicing? What are you inviting other people to practice in that conversation? What are you teaching? What are you learning? What are you creating? What world are you building in each interaction and conversation in your workplace, where you are? Whether that's educating people about Palestine or, saying, why do you think the cops are the answer to that? What happened when the cops showed up last time you called them? What would have been better? You're going to say something, Smile.
I know we're on a short timeline, but something that was said earlier kind of made me start thinking too about movements and the portrayal of movements and how that impacts even how we see movements of yesteryear, as opposed to sometimes the truth on the ground about movements. Because when we talk about when Micah brought up the different ways in which the Stop Cop City movement has been fluid, that does hark back to yesteryear, right? There was an intervening period of when movements were destroyed in the 60s and 70s to where how movements were written about. And they were really written about almost like how the People's History of the United States by Zen did a service to how we started to view history from the bottom up, as opposed to standard historical texts around how history happens. In a lot of ways, I think the interpretations of 60s and 70s movements has gone through that same unfortunate transformation where people started to look at movements through a Malcolm or through a Martin or through other figureheads, and how they started to also think about movements as being pre-planned as opposed to the fluidity and the sort of like, that don't work, hey, let's try this. If that don't work, try this. A lot of that experimentation went on in the movements of the 60s and 70s, the diversity of tactics and strategies that had us to a point where we had both SNCC in terms of Black movements and others and other movements which were grassroots, all the way to the BLA, the Black Liberation Army. So the diversity of organizational tactics and strategies and the diversity of organizations and their interplay amongst ideological formations, some of that existed and of course was destroyed because the state, which holds the power that we are seeing exercised overtly now in Palestine, which we see overtly exercised against us as people organizing on the ground against Stop Cop City, against the people who've been mobilizing, particularly the young folks who've been mobilizing, let's say in this new generation of anti-police brutality mobilizations that's taken place, I'm going to say since Trayvon Martin and on, how the state has mobilized to destroy that and the new ways in which people have tried to organize, that interplay continues to be there, where the state itself uses every tactic and strategy that it has to deflate the ingenuity of movements, to destroy the ingenuity of movements, and to leave us in a period of barrenness where we're sort of picking up the pieces again, right? And we're in a place now, I'll end on this for me, we're in a place now where we're really right in the middle of movement history, where the state is now acting as the state will act. And part of what I think your book brings and probably other things will bring is, what do we do now in the middle of the movements so that we're not looking at ourselves as figureheads, but we're looking at ourselves as this diverse movement that any second now can bring up some new tactics and strategies to fight back that other of us either didn't think about, forgot about, didn't interplay or interject into our movements. And then when it happens, how we need to copy it and fulfill it. So we're really in that moment where like a text like yours should really be food for thought for folks about how do we really start to energize our movements, continue to energize them, and bring about these other strategies and tactics that we interplay and we bring out and we pow before the state itself gets to destroy all of us and starts writing about who were the leaders of our movements and how our movements were formed again.
So true. There's three things that I think about. One is like, yes, we write about the Malcolm X's and we don't write about the Joanne Robinsons. and all the Black women who were part of those networks that were also part of the networks that wrapped themselves around people when the state came with its repression. I think that's the other thing, is that when the state comes with repression, it's our networks and our relationships that save us, including in the current moment in Atlanta and in Gaza. And that's also what the state targets through COINTELPRO, right? They knew the strength of networks and relationships, and they tried to break them. And that's what they're trying to do now with sowing doubt and all the, propaganda, genocidal propaganda, but also with the repression of the indictments in Atlanta, right? They're trying to isolate people. They're trying to peel them off. They're trying to drive a wedge and be like, oh, those nice people who came knocking at your door, that you were kind of building together, thinking about how to build communities that, were safer and thriving and more joyful. Well, they're trying to destroy America as you know it, and they're coming for your stuff, right? And they're coming to take your things. They're coming to take things from you, and they're trying to drive wedges into those networks. They're trying to break those relationships. They're trying to destroy those webs of connection. And we have to recognize that in this moment and everywhere, that they see the strength of this kind of strategy and that they're breaking it. And we also have to see how that strategy has operated in the past. And I think the last thing I want to say is that emergent strategies are deeply embedded in kind of Black feminist politics and practices of collective care. And so that has us looking backward to how we've seen those movements operate in the ways that you were talking about, the civil rights movement and the Black liberation movement and throughout history, but also has us Black feminist future visioning, right, in the ways that Lorraine Hansberry said, we can impose beauty on our future. And that Black feminism is about believing in that impossibility of dismantling all the systems of oppression that operate in the lives of Black women, girls, and trans people. And of course, June Jordan and Audre Lorde and so many other Black feminists saw the occupation and oppression of Palestine as one of those systems that needed to be dismantled. And so we do need to see ourselves in that continuum and that legacy of resistance and as actors in history. And I hope that this book can help people do that. And I think we're out of time. Do you have any closing things you want to say, Micah?
No, I was going to say, I think that's a perfect place to end. And I think it's my job to invite ER back up.
Get the book. But before you do that, make sure that you take one action today. Just one. Email, write, tweet, communicate with someone around what's happening in Palestine, because that's one step to answer your question, how we can employ emergent strategies towards abolition and building new worlds.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. I want to encourage folks, if you would like to get a copy of Practicing New Worlds, you can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen. It also does help you and everybody if you request that your local public library carry it. Don't be shy. Our libraries need our voices and our recommendations. So please, consider also trying to get it into college libraries. We really do love to see these kinds of books make it out into the world. We would love for you to stay in touch with all these links. So they are throughout the chat. And Andrew, do you want to say anything else about the link, the Practicing New Worlds link, and the art that folks will find?
There's merch like the t-shirt and the totes and the notebooks, and the benefits from that will go to Creative Interventions, an organization I mentioned earlier that's about practicing ways of intervening in violence. The Let Us Breathe Collective in Chicago, which is about practicing Black liberation at a local community, national and transnational level. Queer the Land in Seattle and API Chaya in Seattle, similarly working to interrupt violence and create self-sustained, self-determined communities. And so if you purchase stuff, you'll be able to do that. And today or yesterday, we launched a poster from Ollie Costello, whose art many folks will recognize, that tries to sort of provide a visual representation of how emergent strategies operate and sort of in the ways that Kamau was so beautifully describing and Micah was so beautifully describing, where, you know, things ebb, flow, try new things, go around, but that we're moving with an intention to shifting larger systems through those experiments and multiplicity of tactics, strategies, and practices. So I hope that folks will check those out. But buy the book from Charis and then go get your merch from the other side.
Thank you so much. Kamau, do you have any community movement builder announcements that you want folks to know about?
Only that I don't. If they go to communitymovementbuilders.org, we still have a lot up around how to fight back against Cop City. There's the upcoming week of action, and so soon there will be a few more things that'll be put out. That's not only around Block Cop City, but other supportive activities and organizing and civil disobedience and direct action that's going to happen during that same time. So just look out for it.
Awesome. And the Sunday of the week of action, Charis will be hosting youth-focused events, a teach-in for little kids, and an art-making event. So that whole Sunday, it's going to be family-focused at Charis. We'd love for you to bring your little ones to learn about abolition and dream big dreams with us. So thank you all so much for being with us. It is always a pleasure to have the three of you in this virtual space with us. And thanks to everybody watching at home. Stay safe and well, and hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.